the Sacramento Area Council of Governments Policy and Innovation Committee meeting for Monday, March 7th, 2022. Will you please call the roll?
All right, before I call the roll, just a few housekeeping items. As you may have just heard, this meeting is being recorded. For our committee members, if you're not speaking, please be sure to mute yourself. And for any member of the public wishing to make a public comment, please follow the instructions on the agenda posted on the SACOG website. Okay, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your presence. Director Bernasconi.
Here, trying to get my camera to work.
Thank you. Burris.
Here.
Frericks. Absent. Stollard.
Here.
Vice Chair Middleton.
Here.
Vice Chair Thomas.
Here.
And Chair Kozlowski.
So here. Okay, if everybody will stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, excellent. Do we have any agenda updates before we jump in?
We do. The closed session item has been removed from the agenda, and we did have a placeholder action item, and that action item is no longer a placeholder. It is a full action item for the approval of MOU for SACOG's Employees Association and adoption of salary schedules, item 3.
Okay, fantastic. All right, public communication, I guess, will come up first. Is there anybody that would like to speak on a topic that is not already agendized today?
We have no public comment.
Okay. I will entertain a motion or discussion about the consent calendar.
Thomas, move approval of consent calendar.
Second, Middleton.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Would you please call the roll?
Directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi. Director Bernasconi, can you please indicate your vote? Looks like having some technical issues. Absent. Burris.
Yes.
Frericks. Absent. Stollard.
Yes.
Vice Chair Middleton.
Aye.
Vice Chair Thomas.
Aye.
And Chair Kozlowski.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay, great. So the closed session item is been removed. So let's move to item number 4. Would you please call that item?
So the next item on the agenda is action item number 3, approve MOU with SACOG Employees Association and adoption of salary schedules, presented by Eric Johnson of SACOG.
Good morning. I'm just going to share a brief PowerPoint here. So as the board discussed previously, we have been negotiating with SACOG's Employees Association over an MOU that would cover a 5-year period. I'm happy to announce that we've reached a tentative agreement with the Employees Association. And so I'm going to briefly just walk through kind of the final details of that. Also on this item today is the adoption of the salary schedules for SACOG. As you may recall, CalPERS regulations require us to adopt salary schedule anytime the salaries change for public employees. And so we've combined those items today for convenience, but happy to talk more about that piece of this as well. So just a brief overview of the MOU. We have agreed to an economic conditioners reopener, which would give us some flexibility if SACOG runs into difficult budget times in the future. And then we have these other items that I've talked about previously with the board that I'll go through in just a minute here. So before getting into that, I just wanted to briefly kind of highlight what's the overall economic impact anticipated by this MOU. So looking at the totality of the changes in terms of costs that are being added in by increasing some salaries and benefits, as well as offsetting those where we're reducing some liabilities, the net impact works out to about $178,000 per year, which when you look at the total payroll cost of SACOG's annual budget of this current year is about 1.7% of payroll costs. There are some things that are more difficult to capture the savings in the short term, but A few things to highlight. One is that the amount of paid time off that employees are able to keep on the books is reduced by about 40% by next June 30 of 2023. We're also reducing the amount that current employees can take as cash in lieu of medical benefits, as well as creating a new floor for new employees who begin with SACOG, where they get a maximum of $150 and nothing if they receive partial medical insurance from SACOG. And then finally, and I think crucially, while there's no change to it, one thing that SACOG enacted in 2017 is that classic tier employees do actually pay part of the employer share of CalPERS costs, which has resulted in some savings to SACOG over the last several years and will continue to provide savings for SACOG going forward in this MOU. So the new thing since I last spoke with the board about this is the economic conditioners reopener. And so as you may recall, SACOG's overall work program has all of SACOG's funds that come through it, including a significant number of pass-through funds. And so it's difficult on its face to exactly look at what would a downturn in funding mean to SACOG's actual operating budget. And so what our finance director and I have worked out is that there's a set number of funds that really do pay for SACOG staff salaries. And if the aggregate of those funds drops by 10% in any given year, then we would negotiate on the cost of living adjustment and reducing that, as much as zero in any given year based on that, that drop in our revenues. The other things, just to briefly highlight, that were in what I've shared with the board before, but also for the public listening today, we did a salary survey in 2020 to look at how SACOG compares to 14 comparator agencies. And what we found is that most of the positions at SACOG were under market, some significantly so. And so the compromise in this MOU is that one group of employees, our transportation modeling staff, are going to receive an 11% increase to help offset for being 16% under market. And then all of our non-management employees are also going to receive a 3%, which is about the average of what the variance from the median was in the salary survey. We're also making a slight adjustment to our existing cost of living formula. Previously, SACOG had a 0 to 4% cost of living that was applied every July. Due to the economic conditions we're in now and the significant inflation, we've agreed to a one-time increase to the cost of living of 5% for this July. Just noted here for reference is that we work on California CPI. The period that we report on December to December, the actual CPI of this last December was 6.5%. And so anticipating slightly higher than average CPI for next year, July of 2023, we've agreed to let the cost of living adjustment be as much as 5%, but it'll reflect actual CPI if it's less than 5%. And then after that point, we would revert back to the historic 0 to 4% range that SACOG has maintained over time. Moving on to our health benefits. One of the things we also found when we looked at total compensation in the compensation survey was that our health premiums that we paid for at SACOG were significantly below market. And so one of the things to adjust for that is to moving our employees from a historic formula that has had cost sharing and has kind of eroded the amount that SACOG is paying towards insurance, and move towards covering an employee plus one at 100% of the Kaiser rate. And employees can opt into any of the plans that are offered by CalPERS, but it would at least ensure that we keep up with the cost of insurance going forward in this MOU. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a formula for reducing cash for benefits for employees who do not take the full health insurance benefit from SACOG. One of SACOG's most significant non-salary liabilities is paid time off. We have combined sick and vacation leave. And so over the course of 2 years, we're going to reduce the PTO cap there. And historically, we've allowed employees to have any amount that is over the cap move into a 401A plan. In California, PTO is something that you vest with. And so employees, essentially own that time and the value of it. And so this allows us to get that off of SACOG's books and get it into a 401A, which is tax advantage for both employees and SACOG on an annual basis, and at a lower cap will reduce our liabilities in the long term as well. The one change to our retirement benefits is that we are going to start contributing 1% of salary to non-management PEPRA employees into a 401A as well. We found that was a better way to look at the kind of overall attractiveness to new employees, as well as the retention issues for PEPRA employees who are looking at both public sector as well as private sector employment opportunities. So if the committee recommends approval of the MOU today, this would go to the full board at their March 17th meeting. And then the recommended action is for the executive director to sign the final MOU, which would primarily take effect in July of this year, with some modest changes not taking effect until either January of next year or July of 2023. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Hey, Eric, what is the total cost of salaries, just so everybody has a sense of what those COLAs what the impact of those COLAs could be year over year?
Loretta, do you have that number? I don't have that right at the tip of my tongue, but
Yeah, I don't need to be hyper accurate either, just a general ballpark. Because 5% on top of 5, on top of 4, on top of 4, on top of 4 will be a lot of escalation if the CPI keeps up going at the pace that it's going currently.
Sure.
Give me 1 second. I'm pulling up the number right now. Sorry.
So your headline is the accurate one, Eric, which is, the total cost of adjustments is $200,000. But if we have a 5% CPI change, that's well more than $178,000. That's more like what, $900,000 probably.
Right.
If that's 1.7%, or excuse me, more like $400,000.
Yeah, and the $178,000 increase over 5 years, that is assuming a 5% increase this year, a 5% increase next year, and then our long-term CPI assumptions are 3% and kind of moving down to 2% in the out years. So it does.
Okay, then I may be asking a
assume
question that's unnecessary. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that you
okay.
had that incorporated into that number.
Yes, we made a forecast that includes all of the costs.
Okay, then never mind.
Okay.
All right, sorry, I lost the thread on that part.
That's
Thank
okay.
you.
That's okay. It's an important thing, and we also made modest assumptions about our revenues as well over this period. So I think we're comfortable making this recommendation to you.
Okay, excellent. You need us to make a recommendation to the full board on this?
We do.
Okay. Committee members, any questions for Eric? Clarifications? If there's none, I'll entertain a motion to recommend this to the full board.
Move approval, Middleton.
Second, Burris.
Okay, any discussion? All right, Robert, please take the roll on the motion.
And just for the record, there's no public comment on this item. Directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi,
Yes.
Burris,
Yes.
Frericks, absent. Stollard. Director Stollard, please indicate your vote.
Yes.
Vice Chair Middleton,
Aye.
Vice Chair Thomas,
Aye.
and Chair Kozlowski.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, great. Please call item number 4.
Item 4, the advocacy update presented by Sabrina Bradbury.
Good morning. Chair and committee members. We have our state lobbyists here today to give you an update on what we're doing on the budget advocacy side of things. We have Vanessa Cahin and Ed Manning from KP Public Affairs. And just a quick reminder, we secured our $38 million for Green Means Go program last year and circled back with stakeholders. And we know we need more funding to really kickstart infill development in green zones. So this year we are focusing in on seeing what we can do around the infill infrastructure grant program. So I'm going to turn it over to Ed and Vanessa to give you an update on what we're doing there this year.
Great. Thank you, Sabrina. As Sabrina said, I'm Ed Manning with KP Public Affairs, and glad to be in front of you today, Chair and members. So just a quick recap. For the last 2 years or so, it's hard to keep track during COVID years, we were put together an effort to try to get funding for Green Means Go. And when we started the effort, there was no real program in place that would be suited to provide funding for the infrastructure we need to make Green Means Go a reality and open up those areas for housing development and other types of development. That effort was really an effort by SACOG on its own to convince the administration and legislators, both within the delegation and outside the delegation, as to why Green Means Go was sort of a model program for the state and why they needed to think differently about how they use state dollars for infrastructure investment to lead to housing. And we were successful, perhaps too successful, because we did convince everyone ultimately of the merits of it. But in return, they created a statewide program with roughly $800 million or so. But they doled the money out by region, and we got less than we had hoped for, even though we were successful in convincing them on the policy and creating a new program for funding called, built on the existing REAP, what's called the REAP program. And we also got an earmark in the budget. So it was good news, but not as good as we wanted. And so now we're rethinking the strategy. James, it wasn't 800, it was 600 now that I think about it, right? Yeah, 600. If it was 800, we would have gotten more. And that was one-time funding, by the way, in the REAP program. So this year we had to sort of revisit, our approach. And one of the things we had looked at originally was a program called the Infill Infrastructure Program, Infill Infrastructure Grant, or IIG program, as some would know it. And we had thought about that before as a potential funding source, but because it has an existing grant structure, we decided not to take that head on originally and to try to create a different program by going around it. But this time we've made two decisions. One is to revisit that program because it was created quite a while ago by a voter initiative, and it predates SB 375 and predates sustainable community strategies being adopted. It was originally created as proposition through Prop 1C in 2006. And so the program has never been updated since then. And the difficulty with that program is that it is really a competitive grant program statewide, where projects compete against each other, but it really rewards the projects that are in the highest density areas with the most frequency of mass transit, and in particular areas that are served by BART or by subway in LA, for example. And for a variety of reasons, regions like ours do not compete well in that program because we don't have the frequency of mass transit, and we tend not to have the same densities as a result, for basic reasons that we can't really, builders can't affordably build at those densities in a region like ours. And so for that and other reasons, your communities are not competitive in that program. Not to mention the fact that the program doesn't sync up with the decisions made for made by the regions now on where they want to build out their infrastructure based on low VMT. And so this time we're deciding to tackle that directly. The other decision we've made this time is the last time we sort of were the trailblazer, we were going it alone. We were, lobbying for funding for this new vision, and the other cogs were really not very helpful, although they all benefited tremendously from our work. This time, we are actively recruiting the other cogs to be in sync with us to recruit for this new IIG vision, so that it's not just us on our own, but we have a wider appeal for many regions. And the idea is that instead of having a program where you compete project by project, you have a program where regional dollars are guaranteed, and then there's competition within the region with a preference for a high preference for projects, including corridors that correlate with the sustainable community strategy, as does Green Means Go. And unlike the current IIG program, which basically the dollars are correlated to how many housing units are actually going to be built in a project, this would correlate more to what for example, a Green Means Go corridor, what the potential for housing is, not how many units are going to be created by sizing the sewage pipe. And so it's a longer term vision with an emphasis on investing in infrastructure for the long term, not for immediate gratification. Doesn't have the rigid criteria of frequency of transit or these very, very high density thresholds for funding. And with that, it would be a program that would benefit, regions like ours and other parts of the state. So we've been working on that, putting that together, working with the other, with the CalCog in particular, and hopefully bring some of the other COGs on, and trying now to get one-time funding again for this, so that we could get additional funds beyond what we got last year to try to get closer to what we need to make Green Means Go a reality for all your jurisdictions. So that's a quick overview on sort of the idea, what we're envisioning, what we're working on. And now we're going to be fully engaged in the budget process once again. You may have heard there's a little bit of surplus money there, so we would like to help them spend it. And that's what we're going to be doing with your help.
All right. Any questions for Ed on that? I have a few other updates on federal and state advocacy, but if there are questions about what we're doing on the state budget advocacy side and IIG.
Yeah, Ed, I have a question. If you had to sort of boil that out and say, Mike, next time you talk to your state rep, run this idea by that person, or maybe do a little light advocacy on behalf of X, what would that be for each of us? And it might be different because some of us, like Wendy and I, have share an assembly member who is kind of not in the majority. So we need kind of strategy for each side of things.
That's okay. Love all, serve all is our motto. So I would say that we're advocating for one-time infrastructure funding that would be available to our region and other regions through the infill infrastructure grant program. It's a long-term investing in infrastructure to create more housing in infill and other areas that are where we need to grow to try to both hit our housing goals and meet our greenhouse gas objectives. And if that's too long, tell them we need infrastructure funding for housing.
Okay, so how does that fit the rural parts of our region? What's the message for the rep for Placerville? What's gonna?
Pretty straightforward. The Green Means Go program identifies low VMT housing locations where we need infrastructure to build housing out. That includes every part of our region, including suburban, urban, and rural.
Okay.
And I think, Mike, following up on that, I think some of these older communities like Placerville, when our communities were built out much further ago than Folsom or those more emerging communities, our infrastructure is old and it does not support the type of housing that we are looking at. So this is critical funding, I think, especially for Placerville and those aging commercial corridors. So I very much agree with the direction that this is heading.
Gotcha. Okay. I guess I was just I was thrown a little bit by the VMT thing because doesn't have a lot of purchase in certain parts of discussions.
Sure. And I think, yeah, and listen, the audience is different everywhere, and I realize that. And I have clients who are not big fans of low VMT as well, but the truth is, at least based on the data that I've seen and the maps that I've seen, it's surprising some of the Marysville, Placerville. There are areas that correlate to that. Now you don't have to say it that way. You could say we've identified green zones in every part of the SACOG region, and all of those green zones would be priority areas for funding. And Placerville, I think, James, right, has zones in it. As a matter of fact, we lobbied members last year actually pointing out Placerville. I think Frank Bigelow was one of them, James, as I recall. So,
right. Thank you. Wendy, I apologize for singling you out. I just, you're at the top of my picture window here, so it came to mind.
I always like the highlight of the rural regions. Always good to bring that into conversation.
And Chair Kozlowski, I do think this is important, right? Because even sometimes we say the word infill. We've had this discussion many times, but a lot of people, including yourselves sometimes, including our policymakers in state capital, they think, oh, downtown Sacramento, right? The urban core. Yeah. What we're really talking about is the places that already exist, right? Those that where we have infrastructure. And it happens to be, those are the same places, actually people drive less. So there's less environmental impact, there's less traffic. We know for a fact, as Ed said, Yuba City and Marysville are actually a fascinating example. People drive much less there because basically, right, it's sort of they drive, but it's a much more compact, you don't have to drive as far. And when we explained that to things like Assemblymember Gallagher, right, he said, oh, okay, I get it. We're trying to actually do economic development in the place where we already have existing infrastructure. We've already developed it. We're trying to make it better. Like, yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do. And I think the other thing that I would say too, I think Ed mentioned this, but this is a great example of an existing program that our region does not compete well for, right? The standards are so high, not like good high, like high density, high transit frequency, that frankly, even a lot of our local jurisdictions read those and say, well, I'm not even going to bother, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not even going to bother applying for this. And then they don't apply because they know they can't compete. And then the state says, well, I guess there's not a lot of interest in your region. That's not the case. We have a lot of interest and a lot of need as we've documented through Green Means Go. So this is plus up the funding, make it work better, not last money in, but some earlier money, which is what we know we need. and make these grant programs not a sort of a one size fits all, right? But make them work for inland California. And I think that's a great message that seems in my mind, my experience with Ed and Christina and Sabrina and others, you know this, right? Not a one size fits all. Let's right size this to the challenges that regions and local governments themselves have identified. And that plays well on both sides of the aisle.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Sabrina, you had other topics for us, or I guess if there's any other questions on this from directors.
I do have a couple more updates.
Okay, you're
I'll
back
pull
up.
up my slides, so if there are any other questions.
Thank you, Ed.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate the time.
Yep.
All right, can you all see my PowerPoint there? Great.
Yep.
Okay, so we just talked a bit about Green Means Go and the state budget advocacy that we're doing there. I wanted to touch on SB 375 related legislation that we're tracking, and then some bipartisan infrastructure law implementation bills that are moving through at the state level, and then briefly touch on a few other bills that we're tracking. So on 375, there are two bills. One is AB 2237 by Friedman. This is similar to AB 1147 that we worked with Friedman's office on last year to get to a neutral position with some amendments. And there's similar language in this bill, but we have already begun discussions, and she's interested in continuing to work with us on that again this year. And then we have SB 1217, which is an Alan Cortese bill. Last year, they had two separate bills running through the legislature. They became two-year bills and then did not move them forward this year. They have this new bill that seems to be just a vehicle at this point in time for them to have a piece of legislation that they're continuing to work with stakeholders on making amendments to it. So we'll be also engaging on this one and tracking to see where it goes. And then on the bipartisan infrastructure law implementation, there are a few bills that are giving direction to the state about how the federal funding gets allocated at the regional and local levels. And so we're tracking those to ensure that we get as much funding at the regional and local level as was intended by the federal legislation. There's one that's related to bridge funding, and CSAC is a co-sponsor on this one. It would allocate 55% of the federal bridge funding to go to local jurisdictions. And then SB 1049 is related to transportation climate resiliency projects. And MTC is doing a lot of work on this bill, and we're doing some analysis internally to determine whether we take a position on that one or not. And then finally, just wanted to mention again that we're continuing to monitor grant opportunities and think about regional did someone have a question? I'm sorry. No? Okay. That we're looking for opportunities for regional collaboration and coordination on all of the state and federal funding grant programs. We're continuing to work with all of your staff, make sure they're aware of programs, do anything we can on the technical assistance or matchmaking coordination side of things when there's would be benefit to having some joint application efforts. So we'll continue to come back to you with updates there on those efforts. And then a couple of other bills that we're tracking. We did take a support position on SB 922, which would make permanent some CEQA exemptions for bike, pedestrian, and transit related projects. These were temporary exceptions that are due to sunset at the end of this year. And so this would make those permanent, and also added some additional project types like bicycle pedestrian planning, feasibility studying would be able to take advantage of these exemptions. And then we're tracking a couple of Brown Act related bills that would allow for teleconferencing without posting the location. So both of these, they're different language, but the intent is the same, to allow some ongoing flexibility for teleconferencing beyond just a state of emergency like we have now. And so we'll be looking at those to see if there are any red flags to taking a support position there, but particularly at the regional level, we know we've heard from many of you that it is convenient to not have to drive all across the region twice a month. So we'll be watching those bills and coming back to you with updates on those if we take a position. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Sabrina. I don't have any questions. Does any other directors questions about these?
Chair Kozlowski, can I just jump in here for 1 sec? And as clearly there's a lot of things happening at the state level, and Sabrina walked you through many of those, as you know. This is a big year here at the state level. But also some of you are going back to cap at the end of April. And even if you're not going back to cap, I just want to put that as we're helping the chamber put together their, sort of papers, and we'll think a little bit about what's the message we're taking back to DC. I just want to put that reminder in that, and this even hits our funding round and the other things that you'll hear about in the board, right? So much of this big increase in the infrastructure bill at the federal level is competitive grants. So we have to do everything we can, and cap to cap's great, but I'm sure you all know this, being on the policy committee, once a year is not enough, right? We're going to have to get really sharp and early and often with our delegation. And we are going to have to figure out how we are going to be truly competitive, coordinated, and competitive on our federal grants. And Chair Kozlowski, we talked a little bit about this a little while ago. There's never been so much money for competitive grants. There've never been so many different programs. And we want to make sure we kind of have our act together and we are coordinated. And then to be competitive, finally, as you heard at our board workshop last month from our two speakers, we really need to emphasize multimodal, reducing carbon emissions and VMT, equity, safety, right? There's a couple of key things we're really going to have to sharpen our arguments around. So it's because I think some people think this money just coming straight down to the regions. And I want to remind all of us, it's ours to go get, but we got to go get it. And that's not going to be necessarily easy.
Well, then I guess I would ask, what is the thing in the interim before cap to cap that we can each be doing that would be most beneficial to the region or us individually, in your estimation, either Sabrina or James?
Excellent question. I think if you know that your staff is putting together, the thing about putting together a federal grant application, please make sure they check in with us. That sounds simple, but just because I do think we have, I really, they haven't been here for, well, maybe they were here recently, but our federal advocate consultants, I think, are really good. They can really help your staff and our region, I think, really sharpen those arguments. So the more we know, the sooner we know, right? I think the better off we'll be in terms of both coordination and even helping your staff figure out which of the programs is this project or right application going to be most competitive in. So that's a fairly straightforward one, which is please let us know on the earlier side in advance.
So are we talking about applications for programs that are fully baked and the rules exist, or are we talking about those along with other programs that the legislation hasn't been fully cooked yet?
The way that the US DOT and the administration, the Biden administration seems to be doing this is the known program, existing programs are going first, right? So the RAISE program, which used to be BUILD, which used to be Tiger, is due April 14th. And the Transportation Committee actually just approved a resolution actually for a regional grant from SACOG on that. You'll hear more at the board meeting in 10 days. Then infra, if it's not out yet, that's the sort of the goods movement and freight program that's coming because it's a known quantity. They can get that out the door. The newer, then there's a sort of a Q2, Q3, Q4 pretty rough calendar. The newer programs that have nothing yet, I think, are coming more summer and fall.
Okay, so the RAISE program and infra would be the sort of immediate targets, and all of us communicating with you guys so we have some visibility to each other's stuff.
Yeah, and you know what we don't want to do, right, is we don't want to, because there are so many programs, we don't want to take the same application and put them into 3 or 4 different programs. We want to be, because that is noticed. They do talk. And so we want to be thoughtful about it. It's not that you can't go to multiple programs if you don't get the first. Just have to be thoughtful about how I think what our strategy looks like.
Yeah. And I'm assuming RAISE is an acronym. What's the actual spelling of that one?
Oh boy, Rebuilding America's Infrastructure with Safety and Equity, something like that. That's like a trivia night question.
Oh, so it's actually the word RAISE turned into an acronym.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's because there's 2 different raises. That's why I was asking. Could have been RAZE.
I wish those people had been around to have the acronym for the actual bill itself, because IL or IIJA does not hold on. I think Director Stollard has his hand up.
I'm going to start Wordle with RAISE tomorrow.
There you go.
Yeah.
Director Stollard has a hand up.
You said something about wanting us to let you know when we're applying for federal grants. Now, we're working on flood control issues. Are you concerned with things that broad, or?
Of course, what I like about the infrastructure bill, it's truly infrastructure, so that is a good thing. But I think for now, let's just focus on the transportation side of this, or housing related infrastructure, as you just heard earlier from Ed Manning. But we've got enough. I mean, this is a good problem to have. We've got enough programs now just in transportation that even coordinating on that, I think, is going to be somewhat of a challenge. So no, I wouldn't say. Please, Sabrina, Eric, jump in.
Mr. Chair, if I could just add on to that a little bit. So I think another thing we've heard from our federal advocates that's really important for you to know is that they're stepping back, meaning the U.S. Department of Transportation, when they're reviewing these grants and looking at prior awards, right? And so I think, you know, as you're looking internal to your jurisdiction about your priorities, you may not be aware of where other grants have been given in the region, and that will be a factor, right? Potentially in your competitiveness to know where else in the region have we gotten grants in the past. And so I think that's a place where we can help. And just to, you know, to emphasize what James said, we are on top of the programs where the grant guidelines are out, but there's also some where there's legislative language that is not yet turned into regulations. And so we're looking to weigh in on those as they're developed, but also to just help map for you, right? Like, you want to do a bridge that exists and rehab that into something else. Like, should you put your effort into paying a grant consultant a lot of money to write a grant, or should you maybe hold off for 6 months or a year and think about the timing of what programs are coming later on?
So it could be that because money has already flowed to similar projects, yours will be shuffled to the bottom of the pile, or the successful past projects might act as a good template for making sure that you're successful this time. It could be either way, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Very good.
And the only thing I would add to, I think James makes a great point that it's going to take a lot just to be coordinated on the transportation project side. But I know we're also starting to get more involved in the climate collaborative and the state grants. There'll be some need to collaborate on those types of things. So I think that just would be helpful to start thinking through at your local jurisdictions. Are there priority projects that you all have? And like James said, we could help you identify what might be the best funding programs to go after for those different projects.
Yeah. James or Sabrina or Eric, have we ever gone through the exercise of like sort of taking those programs and trying to kind of dry lab what the sort of perfect project is and then giving that as a suggestion to people? Hey, if you have a project like this, you got a great chance because it ticks all these boxes.
I love it. And just so you know, again, we've never had this problem for so long.
Yeah.
We had one program. We had Tiger. That was it. And that was, you know, it was incredible to have one national transportation program. You had to so we've never had this issue. We are working as your SACOG staff and some of your local staff to figure out what does this look like. We've had thoughts about, you know, should there be kind of like office hours or an open house where we can get some of our people who are really good federally on the transportation programs. Like you come in, right? And you're like, here's our concept. And you get a kind of a consultation almost, right? Or trying to figure out how best to do that because so many opportunities and so many.
Yeah, it sounds like whoever's responsible for transportation projects in each community, maybe a workshop day on each of these programs as they become fully baked, you know, get them all together and
so
have a workshop on, you know, just like I said, what's going to be the thing that works the best and who's got the most, you know, project that fits it best.
I know, so stay tuned. I know Christina Lockie and Christina Svensk are working on some ideas that we will be back in front of you with soon.
Terrific. Okay. Any other questions from directors on our advocacy update? Excellent. Thank you very much, Sabrina and Eric. Tom. Sorry, go ahead.
And this is really a whole new world because we've never applied directly to the federal government for programs for a community our size. And I suspect that's true of all of our fellow cities that are, just to say, in the under 100,000 range. So are you saying, you know, we kind of look to SACOG to do that. You've been the conduit for federal money historically for us. Are you telling us now that we've got to basically identify these programs and prepare our own grants? And you know, are you going to kind of begin a counseling role or an encouraging role, or is this all just unknown at this point?
Well, again, it's a good problem to have, Director Stoller, right? I'd rather have this problem than having no money available. It's a challenge, and so I mean, we get it, right? As Eric mentioned, sort of a grant consultant. We don't want you and your staff spending tons of money and tons of time chasing after programs that, you know, maybe it's not the best fit. But I just, the point here, I guess, to sort of just step back of, you know, the takeaway is of all that new money that's available, a lot of that new, not all of it, some of it is going to be a bump up in our formula funds that come down to SACOG and come into our funding round. But a lot of it is competitive, right? And so which are the projects around the region do we actually think could be competitive? And I'm suggesting that we have that early conversation with your staff to figure out if you've got a project, and ideally it would be like across jurisdictions, right? Just what's competitive? Oh, it's multiple agencies and multiple jurisdictions trying to solve problems together. Mm-hmm. So have your staff talk to us about opportunities. It is a high bar in as much as what you have to do to get a really good application together and be competitive. The other thing I would just then connect the dots for you with our transportation team and Christina Svensk talking about the funding round. One of the first programs out the door is this revolving match fund. And the revolving match idea is to give us all as a region some match dollars so we can be more competitive, right? That's a bit of the trade-off.
Okay, so we don't know what we're doing.
I wouldn't go that far, but I think it's a brave new world. I don't think we've been in this world before.
Mhm.
So we've got to be thoughtful and creative.
I would still hope that SACOG would look for those multi-jurisdictional opportunities and be quarterbacking wherever they can.
We would love to. We would love to. But I want to be clear. Yeah, we see that as a great role to play. So what we don't want to do is have somebody the night before an application is due is say, could you send a support letter? And we've never heard of it, right? That's the thing we want to avoid. And it does happen sometimes, just occasionally.
Thank you.
All right, any final words on the advocacy update or questions?
Just, I guess the last headline I'd kind of give you on it is, it's not like, as James said, it's not a commensurate uptick in the amount of funding coming to us, right? We're talking on the order of like a 10 to 20% increase in what goes into our funding round, but multiples of these programs that James has just mentioned, and so many new programs. And so we have to figure out with you and the board how to figure out how to use our small increase to go after that big pot of money out there. So we're here to help.
Mike, if I can take it one step further, are you saying that if we go for an independent grant from our jurisdiction, it's going to be charged against a regional share?
No.
I mean, it would be totally independent of what SACOG gets.
Absolutely, yes. But that's money we aren't guaranteed, right, as a region, right? Other states, other regions can claim all the competitive funding if we don't have good, solid applications.
Right.
And we have to figure out how to stretch the dollars that we have as a region to, like James said, leverage it through a revolving loan program, putting match in from our funding round. Like, you apply for funding, it's not like there's going to be so much more money coming into our funding round that's going to solve all the projects that you want funded. You're going to have to compete a little bit, and it's an okay thing, and we'll help you stretch on that. But it's something that's going to be, I think, a stretch for all of us to figure out exactly what this looks like.
Well, in situations like this, we have to get really good at something really quickly. So that's the challenge.
This has been a really helpful discussion. Thank you so much.
Yeah, very good. Okay, I'm gonna close the door on further comment on this one so we can move through our agenda. Robert, would you please kindly call item 6?
Absolutely. And just for the record, there was no public comment on the last item. So next item is Race, Equity, and Inclusion Meeting Report Out from James.
Okay, great. Chair Kozlowski, committee members. So the REI working group met last February 25th. Couple items on the agenda. There was a debrief on the adoption of the board's adoption of the Race, Equity, Inclusion statement, which was a good discussion, very positive. And again, if hope people have well, you were all there, but that's up on the website now and available. So that was one item. A second item on the February 25th agenda was really looking forward. Just as a reminder, because most of you, Director Middleton is on that, Vice Chair Middleton on that committee working group, maybe or not. The three sort of objectives and work products of the Race, Equity, Inclusion working group are the statement that was adopted, a racial equity action plan, which is now what's next is making good in that statement. What does that look like? What's the work look like ahead? And that'll be being developed this calendar year. And then informing and helping around the long range plan, our 2024 blueprint. We did on the 25th actually spend quite a bit of time, not necessarily on one of those topics, but related, because it's an early, I think, indicator of operationalizing the racial equity statement. And that is a planning program that we are calling Engage, Empower, Implement, or EEI. The board put $3 million aside in the last funding round for this EEI, Engage, Empower, Implement program. You're going to be hearing a lot more about this, by the way, at your board workshop. This will be the workshop in 10 days. And we're going to be getting 2 outside speakers from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the Bay Area, and the San Joaquin Council of Governments, both of whom have used a sort of a community engagement planning program to actually help shape a lot of some transportation priorities in their regions. The calendar on EEI, just again, give you a little bit of a sense of this, and you'll hear more from Rosie Ramos at the board meeting. This year is going to be shaping the framework for Engage, Empower, Implement, and solidifying and finalizing that, and probably with applications for grants next year. And the idea is really trying to work with a lot of our disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, communities of color, so they can be empowered to basically identify transportation challenges and problems and begin coming up with solutions and shaping solutions, which then could be actually used to then pull down future funding. We would do this in partnership with the local governments. This is not SACOG jumping into one of your jurisdictions and saying, hey, we're SACOG and we're here to help. So it's in partnership with local government, but importantly, and we've had some conversation around this, I think with your committee, with community-based organizations, with nonprofits who know communities well. You remember the discussion we had around the bench of consultants recently. So we're really excited about that program. Again, $3 million is sort of a seed fund in some way. It's not necessarily rocket science. It is really important, and I actually think it's actually hard to do well. And then one other just kind of twist on this, and I want to, given the geographic diversity of obviously our board and our region, $3 million because it came out of the SACOG funding round is for the 4 counties, right? So it's for Yuba Sutter, Sacramento, Yolo. And so, because that's what our funding round covers, but we want to develop a framework for all 6 counties. We've been talking very closely with Mike Lucan and Woody Deloria for our 2 RTPA partner agencies, right? What does it look like in those 2 counties? Because we think this is a really, again, just like the REI statement and a lot of our racial equity work and inclusion work, this should cover the full region. So that's one of the question marks to begin to try to answer this year as we go about developing the program. So that was the big topic of conversation, REI, February 25th. There are 4 more meetings of the REI working group this year. It concludes in November. And the big work product that you'll begin to see in front of you is going to be that racial equity action plan. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
I think your report was comprehensive. I usually have a good question ready to go, but in this instance, I think you covered everything that I was moderately curious about. Are there any other directors or perhaps Portia, is there any other comment you think we need to have on this discussion?
No, I think our discussions were very thorough and robust.
Yeah, right on. Okay, excellent. Any public comment on this, Robert?
No public comment on this item.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much to the REI committee and James for synopsizing that activity. I appreciate it. Okay, go ahead and call the next item.
Item 6, the 2024 Blueprint Pathway Framework Outline, presented by Binu Abraham.
Good morning. This is Binu Abraham. I am the project manager for the 2024 update of the Blueprint, formerly known as the MTPSCS or the Long Range Plan. Give me 1 second while I share my screen.
I am going to miss saying MTPSCS, Long Range Plan.
Like a hole in the head.
It makes you sound like you know something, even though you may not.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Robert. All right. So before I start on this item, this is an informational item. Before I start on this, I just want to mention that we have reached a major milestone last month. So before we launch into the pathway discussion, I wanted to take a minute to recap and review what we have done, where we are now, and where we are going. So as we mentioned last month, the board adopted the triple bottom line policy framework. The framework includes the triple bottom line goals of equity, economy, and environment. It also includes a regional growth forecast, which we will be using to forecast the 2035 and 2050 growth for the 2024 Blueprint update. Another component of this is we have an updated engagement and outreach strategy to effectively do outreach and gather input regarding the plan. So together, this constitutes the policy framework along with a set of high-level goals for an integrated multimodal transportation system and regional development pattern that can create a more thriving region for our residents. All this was done right on time, as you can see from our progress map or the process map. It was meant to be completed right at the beginning of 2022. I know it's a little bit hard for you to see, but the pink box is the policy framework, the first pink box. And with that, we have successfully completed the phase 1 of the project. We have now started on phase 2, and we are at the second pink box, which is the pathway framework. It starts now, and it involves 2 components. One is the actual framing of the pathway itself. And I'll go into what the pathways mean. And the second is the call for the transportation projects, which will be in our completed plan. And we want to focus on land use and transportation investments that interact and help us achieve our triple bottom line goals. So what are pathways? In order to understand how the land use and transportation decisions we make today will affect the future, and to identify strategies that can remain durable across a wide range of futures, in spite of changing and disruptive uncertainties, we are undertaking a scenario planning exercise known as pathways. These are the learning exercise to learn comparative differences between widely different set of futures, as I mentioned, focusing on how land use and transportation investments interact to achieve the triple bottom line goals. Even we know that even though the focus is on land use and transportation investment, we know that there are other variables that will affect the outcome, such as working from home, emerging technologies, pricing, etc. So staff is going to be doing a sensitivity testing on all the other variables to learn how they impact the outcomes. Staff is proposing to test 3 different pathways. Each of the pathway will utilize the population, housing, and employment growth projections the SACOG board adopted in February as part of the policy framework. Each of these pathways are exploring a different theme. So the first pathway explores the theme of outward expansion. What happens if we concentrate or we focus on outward expansion? The land use will expand on the historical trends with significant growth in developing communities. This pathway will have the least amount of infill and redevelopment, small lot and attached housing. This is not an extrapolation of the history, but an acceleration of the recent outward expansion trends. This will provide the most rural residential and large lot single family housing. The focus will be on new capacity projects, new highway projects to meet the mobility need. This pathway has the largest number of new roads and capacity projects, and transit will focus on geographic coverage rather than frequency of service. Bicycle and pet facilities will focus on connecting the developing communities to an existing network. Now to pathway 2. The theme of pathway 2 is compact growth and phased expansion. This pathway will be in between pathway 1 and pathway 3 in terms of land use. This is the 2020 MTP SES updated to the current condition. What does that mean? So the 2020 MTP SES, or the current adopted MTP SES, focuses on certain growth patterns and phased expansion, and we will be following the same land use pattern as it is in the current adopted plan. This will be updated to reflect the new regional growth projections and today's condition, such as the base year. In the current MTP SES, the base year was 2016, but currently for our blueprint, our base year is 2020. So we will be updating all the developments and transportation projects that have occurred in the last 4 years. And we will reflect it to show today's market conditions. For transportation, transportation projects from the 2020 MTPACS will be updated based on completed or modified projects. New transportation investments will be included where growth patterns has shifted. The transit service to focus on increased service hours. So that brings us to our last and third pathway, which is inward expansion. This is directly opposite to the pathway 1, which was outward focused expansion. A vast majority of future growth in this pathway will occur in infill areas such as the centers and corridors and established community. This pathway is intended to explore the performance implication of a future that departs from today's land use trends. For transportation, the capacity projects will be used to address bottlenecks and congestion. The transit service will focus on increasing the frequency, and a bike and trail network will fully connect the existing communities. I do want to mention that we are not trying to pick one pathway over the other. This is just an exploratory exercise to learn how does this affect our triple bottom line goals. And we are just providing in this presentation the technical information pertaining to the pathways. But there are other components that are happening, like the engagement, the policy discussions, the input gathering from stakeholders, etc. So that's the pathway, but there is another component that goes into it so that we can test these scenarios. That would be the call for transportation project. So usually we have the call for projects in a spreadsheet format, which, as you can imagine, would be a lot tedious. But for the first time, we will be asking cities, counties, Caltrans, transit agencies, and other partner agencies to use a map interface instead of a spreadsheet to provide us with the project list that will go into the pathway development. Hopefully, this will be a lot more user-friendly. This is a screenshot of the interactive map. The main purpose is to make the most of the project sponsors staff time and focus their efforts on key issues. This time, the sponsors will be able to see their projects in an interactive map and review available data relevant to each of the blueprint goals of equity, economy, and environment. To provide more details about this approach and to orient agencies to the map interface, there will be a special regional planning partnership meeting later this month. So now that we have discussed the pathway and the call for project, what happens next? Over the next couple of months, SACOG staff will develop and test these pathways. We will use this as a learning tool for discovery. We will provide the board with an array of performance metrics and indicators, which will help facilitate a discussion on what strategies and direction the board wants to prioritize on. Using these learnings, we will develop a preferred pathway, and that will be in early 2023, which will become part of the final plan. So with that, I would be happy to answer any questions or comments you have.
This is a lot to unpack. What questions are there out there? Director Thomas.
Good morning. Thank you for this informational overview. It's very helpful. Can you tell me a little bit about what the community engagement process looks like as we move through this?
So, by the way, I just want to mention that I have key staff here who's been working on the engagement part, and each of the component, the transportation lead and the land use lead. So I would like to call on Dov to talk about the land use component or the engagement on this one.
Sure. So there will be, I guess there's engagement on two tracks, right? There's engagement with your local staff and some of our other agency stakeholders. So on the land use side, we would be sort of going and engaging with them over the next
3 to 4 months or so on the actual land use assumptions that will be a part of each of the 3 pathways that Banu walked through. So that will kind of have what we call control total growth by community type. So you'll be able to see, in El Dorado County, like in, the Valley View specific plan, like we're going to have assumptions for units and jobs for, each of the 3 pathways. So that type of engagement. And then we sort of talk with your staff and talk through those assumptions. And then of course there's engagement with our stakeholders, which is, going to be more through like focus groups and, the regional planning partnership and groups like that. And then we will also engage with the public, of course, through our public engagement strategy, which I think maybe Banu can talk a little bit more about the schedule for that, but we're expecting that to be around summer, fall time period.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So we have a whole engagement and outreach strategy outlined, and we will be taking that to our communities and local residents and workshops and everything in summer.
Great, thank you so much. Look forward to it.
Is part of that outreach trying to get some input, or I guess get some input on how to value each of the 3 big categories? Because exactly. I can imagine people having a real passion for one of the 3, but probably not all of the 3.
Right. What we typically do is we tell them, okay, these are the 3 pathways. And if you focus on the first pathway, this is what we see. And the second one, this is what we see. But that is, as you know, is purely academic exercise, because real world doesn't happen by just one pathway. So what we are hoping with our engagement is to get input where people will say, oh, I like this. This is really important for me. So let me combine pathway 1, this aspect, with pathway 3, this aspect, with one of this transit thing from pathway 2. So we want to pick pieces that will then help us bring together a preferred pathway.
So in your mind, are we really on an expedition to educate the public about the balancing of those things, or are we on an expedition to get feedback from them about how to balance those things? I know that that's just a shade difference, but I'm curious.
Yeah, Chair Casat, can I try to jump in here? Because I think you're asking really good questions. And so here's a few things from my perspective. Doing meaningful engagement is really important and is sometimes challenging. Doing meaningful engagement around a long-range plan when you're talking about going out to 2050 is incredibly important, but even harder sometimes to get people to sort of wrap their heads around, right? And so, number one, I think actually you yourself and a couple of others had this idea about getting out to all of the elected bodies. And so we're doing that, by the way. We heard you, and we've got a plan to get out to every city council, every county board of suits this summer who will take us to talk about this blueprint plan. Number two, we are still trying to figure out how and when to really best meaningfully engage the public. Because the thing that Banu just gave you about these pathways, I would say is we're trying to really tease out and differentiate, right? Much bigger variations than we have in the past. Because we think it's the right time to do that, given how a lot of things have changed the last few years, but it's more meaningful when people see different kind of versions of the future. Exactly how to do that in a meaningful way at the right time so people actually not just can engage and get educated, but provide meaningful feedback, we're working on it. So you're asking a good question, and we really, like we do with a lot of these things, we are really trying to figure out the right time, right? And with the right set of questions and information that is sort of a two-way exchange. So we have not figured that out yet, I would say, but we are working on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a fascinating intellectual exercise, and the vast majority of people that you'll encounter won't have the time to think deeply about it. They will, fall back on tropes that they have, anecdotal sort of feelings about, and trying to, get them past that part may be the most challenging thing. So for whatever that's worth. Tom, you had Director Stollard.
Thank you. I really appreciate the presentation as well, Binu. Thank you. Couple thoughts. First of all, one of your earlier slides projected population for 2030 and 2050. I think it would be helpful if you also showed what today's population is on that slide to help us appreciate the amount of growth that's going to occur in that increment. That's not a fact that all of us know all the time. So if you'd add that to the slide, I'd appreciate it. My second thought is, this is truly living up to the spirit of the original blueprint. In that session, there were 4 large charts on everybody's table showing what would happen if we follow different development strategies. And A through D. A was anything goes, D was very tight. And almost all tables ended up, when they looked at these, at C or D, because they didn't want us just to, shall we say, sprawl all over the place. So what we did was, we weren't talking, are you pro-development, are you anti-development, which was the old paradigm. Instead, we're saying, what kind of development do we want and where do we want it? And then it just changed the whole character of the discussion. I think, then it isn't like we're trying to tell you what to do. We told everybody, you're going to get the community you want or that you allow to happen. It's your choice. Here's the implications. It was such a cool thing. So I love this concept of pathways. None of us really want anything goes, because we love the beauty of our nature and a lot of our development has been done very well. But at the other end of the extreme, we don't want Big Brother telling everybody exactly what has to go where either. So finding the sweet spot is the nature of what will happen to those public discussions. And I really think it's a terrific way to approach it. So thank you for bringing that pathway concept to this discussion.
Thank you, Director. And I will add the base here, the 2020 population and housing numbers.
Thank you.
And bring it back to you next time.
If I always appreciate Director Stollard, you giving us the context back to the blueprint, right? And that it is no accident that the staff has renamed this, partly you're urging the long range plan, the blueprint. The other thing that I've been saying to the other committee is just to in some ways get you all warmed up around, and maybe many of you have gone through some scenario plan. There are different kinds of scenario planning. We're calling them pathways. But at your board retreat, April the 8th, we're going to begin an exercise that is not as specific, I think, as these pathways, but just kind of, imagine the future and what's gone right and what's gone wrong, kind of a thing. At your April board meeting, we've invited the head of Envision Utah, who in some ways was the predecessor to the Sacramento Region's blueprint back in 2004, to come and talk about what happened with Envision Utah 20 plus years ago and what they actually envisioned the year 2020. So we're going to hear a little bit about that. And if you can make it the board trip that Chair Jennings has asked us to sort of curate at the end of June to Salt Lake City, to then go and actually see it in person. So there will be multiple bites at this, right? Because it is while it's again, perhaps a sort of an obvious concept, what are the different futures that are before us, right? It's not an obvious one actually to use, I think, effectively and to engage in, and also to have all of you begin to help communicate that back out, right, to your own constituents and your own stakeholders. So more to come and more opportunities.
Very good. Any final words or questions from directors? Awesome. Binu, great job. Thank you. Dov, thanks for being on hand, and James for summarizing things.
Thank you.
All right. Let's move on to the next item, please, Robert.
We are on item 7, the draft 2023 Regional Active Transportation Program Policy Framework, presented by Victoria.
Good morning, I'm Victoria Cacciatore with SACOG staff, and I'm here to get your input on the draft policy framework for the Regional Active Transportation Program. To take a quick step back, what is the Active Transportation Program? And well, that is a funding program used to increase biking and walking throughout the state of California. We also have a share of that funding that goes towards a competitive 6-county program that SACOG implements with El Dorado County Transportation Commission and Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. So today I'm asking for your input before the draft framework comes back to the Transportation Committee and then the board in April for final action. So statewide, I mentioned that this is both a statewide program and a regional program. Statewide, we're expected to have about $298 million to distribute through the Active Transportation Program, and regionally, we'll have about $15.9 million to distribute. This is a 35% increase above past ATP funding estimates due to the influx of federal funding. And as you're picking up, there are a lot of unique things for the Active Transportation Program, a state program that also aligns with a regional amount of funding, which is kind of different from what we've been talking about through the rest of discussion items today. But let me take a moment to walk through the process for ATP funding distribution, which is perhaps one of the most unique parts of it. So with Active Transportation Program, project sponsors have the opportunity to submit their projects to a state competition first. They are evaluated using a state process and evaluation criteria. We use forms that are developed by Caltrans in coordination with the California Transportation Commission. And following that competition throughout the state, unsuccessful projects then have the option to compete regionally in the regional program. So projects that didn't get funding through the state then come to the 6-county region. They use a regional application and are evaluated based on regional criteria, which are what are before you today in attachment A. And we recognize that there's a lot of work that goes into filling out funding applications. So through our regional round, even though we have a different application, we use as much information as possible and pull that forward from state applications. I would note though, nobody is required to apply to the state competition first. We strongly encourage agencies to do that, to have 2 bites at the apple. All of these programs, even though we have regional criteria such as the potential to contribute to a greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategy, that's something that's unique to our region, not considered fully in the state program. We work to leverage as much as we can from that state application. So what we're looking for is an application process that is very similar to what was used last time. So cities, counties, school districts are encouraged to apply to the state first. SACOG will work with El Dorado County Transportation Commission and Placer County Transportation Planning Agency to develop application materials and tools that will use the state application whenever possible. And then we look to continue using regional criteria such as reducing greenhouse gas emission and supporting economic prosperity. The most significant changes that we have are grouped under these 3 buckets. So the first part is resuming an 11.47% requirement of non-ATP investment. This directly relates to a one-time reduction in the non-ATP funding requirement that we implemented last round. When we were adopting the policy framework for the regional ATP the last time, it was in spring of 2020, and we were experiencing an unprecedented amount of economic uncertainty, especially around a lot of the local revenues that are often used as non-ATP investment to put forward these biking and walking projects. So it had been framed as a one-time reduction. We're now looking to resume the 11.47% requirement of non-ATP funding to compete regionally. The second category is using the $15.9 million of regional ATP funding to further regional plans and the implementation of them. So we propose continuing to include Green Means Go implementation as part of the regional plan segment of this funding program. We know that Green Means Go is a more developed program than it was when we first put this mention of Green Means Go in there. But we also know that the improvements and infrastructure needs that active transportation program funds can cover are different from what people would be able to do with Green Means Go implementation funding. So we think that it's a really good opportunity to have the funds work together to address these infrastructure challenges more comprehensively. What is new as far as regional plan implementation is proposal to include a new scoring criterion for implementing the regional trail network. This is a follow-up from the last time we took the policy framework forward for the 2021 regional ATP. We heard interest expressed by the board for using ATP funding to implement this regional plan for the regional trail network identification and the action plan that we'll be finalizing in June of this year. At that time, back in 2020, we weren't far enough along in the process to identify a clear path for plan implementation, but we believe that the time is better aligned for using the 2023 regional ATP to help get some of these trail projects advanced. And then the last bucket is looking to increase the investment minimums and goals for projects that are going to benefit disadvantaged communities. So to provide a little bit of framing for how disadvantaged communities are discussed in terms of the state active transportation program and also the regional active transportation program. There are 5 different ways that the state defines disadvantaged communities. They use median household income, they use Cal Enviro screen tools, they use free and reduced price meal programs from schools. They use the Healthy Places Index, and they also look to tribal lands. And then regionally, we add in metrics such as the environmental justice communities that are part of the long range plan Title VI analysis. So when we are discussing a potential increase in the minimum investment level, raising it to 40%, that is going to be more or less tied to federal policy initiatives such as Justice 40, which identifies that 40% of the funding should go towards projects benefiting disadvantaged communities. This is our past investment history in projects that served underserved communities. Across all of the rounds, we've invested about 2/3 of our regional ATP funding in projects that were going to provide a meaningful benefit to disadvantaged communities. But this is in excess of the state requirement that was written into the initial law, Senate Bill 99, that was then turned into the active transportation program, which required 25% of the investment should go towards projects benefiting disadvantaged communities. Our proposal of 40% is, while in line with the federal initiative, it's also a more meaningful floor for our region. While we have exceeded 40% across all of the prior rounds that we've had this funding program to implement, we are getting closer to what our actual minimum might be. And then looking at having an aspirational goal of 60%. As you can see, we have not invested 60% of our ATP funds across all cycles, even though when you average across all of our prior investments since the program started in 2014, we have exceeded that level. How this relates to the scoring process that's in front of you is that right now, we use the points that discuss the benefit to disadvantaged communities and the residents of those communities as more of a reporting metric. And we only add in those points if we are failing to meet our state requirement of 25% investment. So we would have a higher sort of trigger for adding in the points that discuss the project's benefit to disadvantaged community residents if we didn't have a funding package that proposed 40% of all available funding go towards those disadvantaged community residents and serving their active transportation needs and helping move the needle on those investments. So that is the synopsis of what we're putting forward in the policy framework. And you can see the track changes version in attachment A that shows the differences from last regional active transportation program. And I wanted to give a quick highlight of upcoming milestones. The statewide program, where they'll be distributing just shy $300 million towards biking and walking projects throughout the state of California. They will announce a call for projects on March 16th, and applications will be due June 15th. And then, as I had mentioned, this is the opportunity for members of the Policy and Innovation Committee to provide their feedback on the draft regional ATP policy framework before we finalize that, take it to the Transportation Committee in April, and then hopefully to the full board for adoption and then sending off to the California Transportation Commission. So with that, I'd like to pause for any thoughts on the proposed changes or questions, et cetera.
Can I just, you said that the California Transportation Commission is going to do a call for projects on March 16th, and applications would be due when? June 16th?
June 15th.
June 15th. Okay. All right. And then we're trying to make a recommendation from this committee to the full board so that the board can take action on April 21st.
The action item or the home committee for this item is Transportation Committee. So it's more getting your input in the final version that staff will take to the Transportation Committee in April.
Okay. So we're going to discuss this again at the beginning of April then?
It's not scheduled to come back to this committee unless it would be of interest to any of you, but Transportation Committee is the acting committee. We could, if you wanted, have a more thorough discussion with you, but that would be up to you and the staff lead.
Okay. All right. Well, are there questions for Victoria from any of the board members? Ms. Thomas.
Not a question, but a comment. I would just like to say I'm really delighted to see that part of our framework is the further implementation of our regional trail network. I think that is such an important task for SACOG to undertake. And just a brief anecdote, one of the communities in El Dorado County had a horrific tragedy a couple of weeks ago when a 14-year-old girl was killed by a hit and run drunk driver on her way from a local gas station to her home after school. And this happened along one of our rural roads where there's no room for sidewalks. There's no room for any of that. And as I've been walking through my community with this horrific tragedy, we had a big all hands on deck meeting last week, and the community is very, very interested in looking at parallel capacity along this rural road, because it does could connect to our trail network. And had we had that parallel capacity, it could have saved her life. So very excited about additional funding for this. And I've already reached out to Woody, and we'll be putting in an application for this. So just want to strongly support the advancement of the trail network. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Other directors who'd like to comment or may have questions? Okay, well, this is certainly something important for us to do. I think your presentation was excellent, Victoria. Thank you. I just wanted to leave open the idea that we may want to talk about it some more, but I think it's a sensible way for us to go forward so far. So thank you. All right, any public comment, Robert?
No public comment.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so I guess we're on to our last item, the receive and file. Is there any need to discuss that at all?
We need to discuss the receive and file.
Okay, fantastic. Any other items from staff for the good of the order?
Yes, I just wanted to highlight to committee members that Lynette Espinosa, our board clerk, sent out an email about our April committees. We are anticipating to return to in-person meetings starting in April. For anyone in the public who's listening, we are going to continue to have the same online opportunities for public comment and viewing all the meetings. So we would encourage people, if they can't, this is really about Brown Act rules and teleconference notices, as you heard from Sabrina's item earlier. So we're working on options. April will be our pilot test to see how it works to do that. But please let Lynette know about your preferences, and we'd be happy to work with you one-on-one about that.
Excellent. And Eric and I discussed earlier this week the fact that some of the members of this particular committee actually travel a good long distance to get to Sacramento. You can participate remotely, but your location has to be someplace reasonably public because it needs to be publicly noticed. So if you'd like to, Zoom into the meeting from the city hall in your town, that's absolutely something that he can arrange.
Yep, we just need to know about that in advance. So Lynette's happy to work with everybody on what you'd like to try in April and going forward.
Fantastic. Okay, excellent. Well, then I will adjourn our meeting and thank everybody for their participation and attention. Staff, thank you very much for robust discussions on everything, and we will be adjourned until April 4th of 2022, where we will meet again at 10 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. Good evening or good
Thank you.
afternoon.